I'm Neil Nobel, editor-at-large of The Prickly Pear, and welcome to 10 Minutes on the Cactus Patch. Our guest today is Jonathan Riches, who is Director of National Litigation and General Counsel for the Goldwater Institute, perhaps Arizona's most influential think tank. Jonathan, thanks for dropping by.
Thanks for having me on board, Neil. Appreciate it.
Our subject today is Proposition 208, which for a lot of us, it was a bit of surprise that it passed. I know that Arizona is turning a bit purplish, but that was the largest tax increase in Arizona history. And I was a little surprised that it did pass. It passed fairly narrowly from the latest data. It seems to be a little less than 2%, maybe 1.75%. But the Goldwater Institute objects to this, I guess, on two fronts. One, the economic front, and secondly, the legality of it. So if you would, for our listeners, briefly review what is Proposition 208 and what your problems are with it.
Sure. Yeah, and you referenced it in your opening remarks. Prop 208 represents the single largest tax increase in the history of the state of Arizona. It takes Arizona's top tax rate of 4.5% and it increases it an additional 3.5%. So that represents an 80% increase of the top tax rate in the state.
Wow.
And look, I mean, you can't raise the top tax rate by 80% and not have serious economic consequences. And we're going to see those. In fact, we're already seeing those in the forms of lost jobs, lost revenue, lower wage growth, and importantly, what we're seeing now, lost migration, both into the state and then, of course, folks leaving the state as well. Already, unfortunately, we're seeing media accounts of businesses that are choosing to pack up their bags and leave Arizona for some of our surrounding states or other low tax states in the South. And that's just going to get worse, unfortunately, if this measure stays in effect.
We'll be quite non-competitive with Texas, with Utah, Colorado, and other states, will we not, given this disparity in taxes?
No, it's exactly right. I mean, we've gone from one of the lowest tax jurisdictions in the country where we are hyper competitive in high growth states like Texas, even to a lesser extent, Nevada, as you say, Colorado, now to one of the very highest tax states. We're now in the company of New York, New Jersey, California, God forbid. So it's really flipped the entire script that was bringing and attracting businesses into the state right on its head. And it's going to have, frankly, it's going to have devastating consequences. And you look, along those lines, this was sold as a measure that only raises taxes on the rich. In reality, this tax is going to fall on middle-class wage earners and small business owners. Half of all of those that are going to be subjected to this new tax are small business owners. So this is just, it's going to really devastate our economy. And it's sort of tragic that the proponents attempted to misrepresent those real basic facts in advocating for this.
The proponents, as I understand it, was a think tank in Portland, Oregon, and the teachers union primarily. I always find it amusing that out-of-state interests want to inflict a tax on citizens of another state when they're not there to have it inflicted on them. Right. That was kind of an interesting origin of that thing, but I guess we have to thank primarily the teachers union in this state for this piece of proposition.
Yep. And as you say, out-of-state interests that are trying to use Arizona as some sort of testing lab, and they're not going to bear the consequences of the destructive policy that they advocated for.
Well, it could be argued, as unwise as this initiative was, the people spoke and it passed. Your objections are that this is structurally flawed from the beginning. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And look, respecting the will of voters means respecting the constitutional limitations on government spending and the way government raises taxes that voters themselves put into place in the Constitution. So look, we have a system in Arizona that allows for both citizen initiatives by statute and citizen initiatives by constitutional amendment. And the citizens themselves have put in safeguards that limit both how money can be raised and how money can be spent in this state. And Proposition 208 attempts to evade both of those limitations. And any first-year law student can tell you Prop 208, which was passed as a statute, no statute, whether it's passed by the people or the legislature, can override a constitutional provision. And Prop 208 does that in some cases expressly, and it frankly overrides several provisions of Arizona's constitution.
Well, tax increases really are supposed to come from the elected representatives of at the legislature, correct? And this is not the case in this proposition. And secondly, as I understand it, there's really no structure for overseeing the spending that is part of this. Can you explain that?
Yeah, yeah. And in fact, so starting with the spending, Arizona's constitution limits the amount of expenditures that can be made on public education in the state. And it defines what those expenditures are very, very broadly to plainly include money that would be received from Prop 208. And Prop 208 in its language says, well, we're going to exempt ourselves from that portion of the Constitution. So this doesn't count as local revenue for that portion of the Constitution, which of course you can't do. It also creates other interesting and problematic spending issues. Of course, the legislature has the ability to budget, to create appropriation priorities. This attempts to limit the legislature's authority to do that because it not only provides for this tax increase, but also essentially sets a floor to legislative spending on public education as it exists now. So it sort of is directing the legislature to say you can never back off of this cap that the measure sets, which creates structural problems. And then finally, as you mentioned, the Arizona Constitution does limit the way taxes can be raised in this state, and it quite expressly says that if taxes are going to be raised, the legislature has to do it, and the legislature has to do it by a 2/3 supermajority requirement. Of course, here the legislature didn't act. The people did. It was not passed anywhere near a 2/3 requirement, and it was not passed as a constitutional amendment. It was passed as a simple statute.
Were the proponents aware of these flaws, structural flaws?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, on the school spending limitation that I had mentioned, which is frankly the most egregious of the violations, although they're all bad, the Nonpartisan Legislative Council, which reviews ballot language for constitutionality, for proper form, told the proponents during an open hearing and then later by letter that the provision that tries to exempt itself from the Constitution is, quote, likely invalid. And that's a nonpartisan group. And so they clearly had notice of this. They could have cured it. They could have run this as a constitutional amendment, but they decided to choose the easier unconstitutional path of running it as a statute.
Has an initiative in Arizona ever been ruled unconstitutional before?
Oh, sure, yeah, that has happened. That has happened many times. Look at the people have the power of the initiative, but their power is no greater than the legislature when they're acting through the initiative process. And just as if the legislature, or just when the legislature passes unconstitutional laws, the same constitutional restraints that apply to those also apply to the initiative process.
So are there limits on what the people can do, or we wind up with a situation, was it Benjamin Franklin that defined democracy as two wolves and a sheep sitting down to decide what's for dinner?
Right. Or as Madison said, you have a tyranny of the majority problem. And that's frankly precisely what we're seeing here.
Here it's a tyranny of a tiny plurality above, because it was just about 50-50 going down to the wire. And that's if the votes were counted correctly. Well, what happens going forward, Jonathan? What's the process? You're going to file an injunction or something like that. And what's the timetable? What's it look like?
So we have filed the case, and then along with the case, we filed what's called a preliminary injunction, where we have asked the trial court to not implement or to put on hold the implementation of Prop 208. The court is going to have a hearing on that on December 23rd. So it should be a very, very Merry Christmas. And then I expect a ruling from the court shortly after that hearing. And then I suppose one side or the other will have the ability to bring up some possible appellate options.
And that would then be appealed to the Arizona Supreme Court, I presume, or?
Potentially, yeah. The Supreme Court's a court of discretionary review, so either party would have to ask the Supreme Court to take it. But this is plainly an issue of statewide concern that ought to be of interest to the court.
Are you optimistic?
Yes. It's an unfortunate reality that this measure is drafted so poorly, so plainly tries to exempt itself from the Constitution that, um, you know, I think a court would be hard pressed to find that major components of this law are not invalid.
Very good. Well, I hope you will keep us posted on this process. We really appreciate the time you've spent with us today, Jonathan. For those individuals who wish to assist you in what you're doing at the Scharf Norton Center there and the Goldwater Institute, how can people help the Goldwater Institute?
Sure, you can go to our website, goldwaterinstitute.org, and you can find all of our work there and also opportunities to support our work there.
Jonathan, thank you so much for spending the time with us today.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.